The big debate about caste-based census, whether or not India should carry out a census, collect data and analyze data of India's population based on the caste and their social economic status. That's the big debate that has again been reignited. In fact, for the last year and a half, several of the opposition parties and even BJP's allies have been pushing for this. Why is it gaining steam right now, and what is the importance? That's what we're going to talk about in this edition of Simplified with me, Tanvi Shukla. But first up, let me clarify one thing to you. Even though the commonly used term is caste-based census, know the fact that we already do a partial caste-based census. So even now, the data that the government and the authorities collect every 10 years does have information and details about the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and they're categorized that ways. Beyond that, we do not collect the data in details when it comes to the other backward classes. And so largely, when you hear opposition parties and then the news agencies repeating that claim, demanding a caste-based census, do understand that most of them are actually speaking to garner more details and make them public when it comes to the OBCs. So that's one thing that I wanted to make clear. Why are we talking about it? Obviously because Bihar Chief Minister has again called for unity and pushed for the demand of a caste-based census. Now remember, the 2021 census hasn't really taken place yet. Last year it was delayed because of COVID, or at least that's what the government said. This year again, it doesn't seem as if it's going to take place. The government is now talking about an e-census, which might again take some time. So the census that last we had was done in 2011. In fact, since we're talking about when was the last time we did a census, let me give you a brief history of what's really happened in the last 100 years. So actually in our country, till 1931, during the British era as well, we used to collect exhaustive data about our population, which also had the caste specific data. So till 1931, that information was collated and was tabulated. Then for various administrative purposes, largely because Britishers had several other things on their plate, in 1931 they suspended the caste-based data, even though they carried on with the rest of the exercise. When India became independent, we completely abandoned that exercise, and since then we've only been collecting not for all segments and categories and castes, but largely only for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Now, there was a much debate in the early 2000s. In 2011, it was hotly debated in the parliament. The then UPA government decided that let's actually carry out a caste-based census. We need to get a sense of what is the current situation in our country basis these various categories. But when they did this census and looked at the numbers, something went wrong. And then the government said, no, wait, this census exercise was flawed. There were way too many errors, there were way too many mistakes, and we cannot make it public. So they never used it and they never made it public. And so round and round, we continue to have this debate even in 2022. 11 years later, when it is time for the next census exercise. Let's understand whether India needs it or not, what went wrong, and why do we need it if we do. And I say good evening to Professor Ravi Srivastava, Professor and Director for Center for Employment Studies and Institute for Human Development, joining me right now. Thank you so much, Mr. Srivastava, for being with us. I want to carry on with what I started with, which is explaining people the caste-based census and what does this really entail in the form that many political parties are now asking for.
So, Tanvi, as you rightly pointed out, under the British, we carried out a caste-based census. Between the years 1871 and 1931, every decennial census had detailed, disaggregated caste-based information. And in fact, many of us, when we look at the distribution of population, when we look at the electoral geography of India, we have to go back to the 1931 census because there is really nothing after that. But over the last few years, last few decades, there has been a spate of political reservations at the local level, in particular for OBCs. There have been various policies, and as we know, actually Article 16(4) of the Indian Constitution does call for affirmative action policies for socially and economically backward classes who are generally identified as being the other backward classes. So there is therefore not only the need to have more detailed, more disaggregated information on the caste distribution, not only at a broader level, but also at the local. And that really is the core of the need for having a caste-based census. The fact that we need affirmative action policies, the fact that political reservations or reservations for for electoral representation are being made in local bodies based on the distribution of population. Administratively, states have carried out censuses, but these are very, very rough and ready censuses looking at the distribution of populations locally. But we do not have a categorical census, a population census, which looks at this information. So this is a gap, and this gap has persisted post-independence. As you pointed out, 1931, we had a caste-based census. 1941 was the war years. There was an abbreviated census, but post-independence, we collect very detailed information on scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, but we do not collect information on other caste groups. Therefore, there is this need, this void which needs to be filled. I would also just like to point out that while the census does not collect this information, the National Survey Office, the NSO, does collect information on other backward classes in the various surveys that it does. These are sample surveys. Usually information is collected on 100,000 plus households in different rounds. And in these rounds, we do collect information on other backward classes. So we do have the information, and this is the kind of information that the Sachar committee used along with other administrative information on the general situation of socially and economically backward classes, including the other backward classes. So this information does exist, but it doesn't exist at the local level. It is not disaggregated enough.
Yes, in fact, and like you pointed out, the NSO does this survey, and in fact, the one that they did again over 15 years ago did give us some kind of an indication of what the OBC mix and percentage would be, and which was actually much lower and much different from what the Mandal Commission had calculated and projected in the 90s when they came out with that report. So there are varying numbers, largely between 45% to almost 50 to 54%, and this is what most organizations or governments seem to be working with. But like you pointed out, it's very important, not just at a national level, when you bring in your welfare schemes, when you bring in your reservation schemes, to know what the existing status is, but even at the local level, for various government initiatives, even for a ministry like, for example, the Ministry of Minority Affairs, and they have a series of schemes and benefits for various minority categories and various caste categories. And how do you decide that? How do you really decide which category needs additional help, in what direction, in which segment, whether it's food or employment or education or health, geographically speaking, or otherwise? How do you know that if you don't have updated information about these caste categories? Now, I was trying to read up more, and for the longest time we didn't really have the details. So why the government decided in 2011 to not give us that information, to keep that caste census back and not make it public. They said there were a lot of mistakes, there were a lot of errors, and then the whole exercise had gone haywire, and the data could not be trusted. Then when the government submitted a detailed affidavit in the Supreme Court last year, when a case was being heard about whether or not there should be caste census, they spoke more about that data, and that gave us some more insights as to what were these flaws, and I want to talk about these flaws. Essentially what experts also tell us, and government also indicated, is there was no registry that was made about the caste. So you didn't write down to say, well, these are the list that the surveyors must refer to when they go out on ground, and then according to this registry you categorize people when they tell you their caste. And as a result, what happened when the enumerators went out and they noted down people's caste, they used different spellings, which led to different caste categories, and suddenly you saw massive ballooning in the caste categories. And there are two examples just to explain this point. For example, in Maharashtra, the existing SC, ST and OBC categories are about 494. But when the census was done, it gave over 4.2 lakh categories or subcastes. Similarly, 99% of the castes that were enumerated had a population of less than 100 people, so that just became even more complicated. If you see it at a national level, it's a similar problem. Total castes as per the 1931 census were 4,147. When the 2011 census was done, it showed presence of 46 lakh different castes. Now you can say picture can change from 1931 to 2011, but can it really change from 4,100 odd castes to over 4 lakh caste categories? That's when it went wrong. But that doesn't mean that you don't try again and then you do not try to bring this information in better form again. Why hasn't that happened, Professor Srivastava, when most political parties seem to be in favor of it, when most political parties heavily bank on caste-based politics for their own identity and survival and success, then why is it that we've not tried to correct these mistakes even 11 years later?
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. First, let's just analyze the mistakes which could possibly occur. So the census and also the NSO surveys basically they look at self-reporting categories. So you could report yourself as X or Y or Z, anything, and the census enumerator has to put it down at X or Y. There is no other way. He cannot independently verify whether you belong to a particular caste or subcaste or something like that. He has to put it down. So unless there is a list to which he can actually refer to, that list may include caste, subcaste, and so on, and these are could be very regionally varied. there is bound to be a great deal of discrepancy. And there will be a lot of problem in how do you synthesize the results of a survey like that. So it could be possible that in 2011, when a census of this kind was carried out, the government was not fully prepared, and the categories and subcategories that came up were far larger than what the government had anticipated. Now, the best way to deal with it was actually to put out the data, because if you put out the data, then there would be anthropologists, social scientists who would look at it at local levels, and including, of course, the political class itself would look at it, and these exercises would tend to get resolved, or at least partially resolved, over a period of time. The government chose not to do that. So the only reason for not doing it could not only have been that there was a lot of confusion in the self-reporting of caste. It was obviously a political decision. The Ministry of Home Affairs decided, as it quite often does, the census comes within the purview of the Ministry of Home Affairs, and the Ministry of Home Affairs decides what it should publicize and what it should not publicize. The same problem, by the way, occurred with the religion-wise census data being reported way back in 2001. We saw this again with the caste-based census data in 2011. The MHA decides what is politically expedient to publicize and what is politically not expedient to politicize. Had this data come out, this data would have undergone a degree of refinement, because people would have looked at it and said, well, you can aggregate A, B, and C, or you cannot aggregate A, B, and C, and we would have got the self-reporting categories at least. But there's another problem, and I think when we look at self-reporting categories, we have to be aware of it, is that castes are actually aspirational. So being aspirational in nature in India, they are always in a fluid state. They're always in the fluid state. We know the last 100 years, 150 years, we have ethno-history of castes in India, how, for example, smaller castes got coalesced into larger castes, how they moved up the social ladder, or they tried to move up the social ladder by acquiring other, kind of surnames and so on and so forth. So they basically, caste is actually not a very ossified category. It is a fluid and dynamic sociological category. And it will remain that way. The census has to recognize this. And first, that it is only going to come up with whatever is self-reported. B, that whatever is self-reported is always going to be contaminated with the ascriptive status that people, ascribe themselves in terms of caste and categories. So there will always be a certain degree of fluidity. And this is not an administrative category, but because when we come to the administrative category, as happens with the ST and ST, census, when people want a certificate, when they want
Yeah.
a ST certificate or an ST certificate, they will go to the revenue authorities. The revenue authorities will look at their family backgrounds and so on and so forth. And then they will give them a caste certificate that you belong to X caste. That is what they will be able to use for reservation purposes, for job reservation purposes. That is what presently happens as well.
Correct.
It is for OBCs or for wherever reservations apply. People have to get certificates from administrative authorities. So those kind of certificates are very different from the self-reported categories which the census will come up with. But there is value in still coming up with the kind of data which census will have, because there is no other alternative for it. There is no other alternative for it. And it will need to be refined over time. That is something we need to accept. There will be fluidity in the data. That is something we as social scientists need to accept. You cannot ossify caste.
So you're saying that when it comes to collecting this larger data, especially when you bring in the details of the OBCs, there is bound to be some amount of fluidity for the reasons that you just listed out. And that's not the same when we are looking at the current exercise where you are collating the same data for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Would that be correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, but nevertheless, even as the government also tells us and gives this as a reason, and those who argue against it also use this as a reason to say, well, the exercise is too cumbersome, it threatens to actually derail the overall census. The government in fact now also says it's too late to bring in caste-based census this time, because now is the time to do it and you need 3-4 years of preparation. That might well be it. Although we don't know when the next exercise will take place. But you are saying even though there are these problems, that is for the social scientists to know, understand and factor in when they read the information and read the data, but we definitely do need the data. Now let me come to one more point and why we need this data. The last set that we got was in 2011. And that's what most government or policy makers, Mr. Srivastava, would refer to when they decide their policies on who needs what kind of welfare help. 10 years later, we don't have an updated data. We don't know when we will get that. Is it a big concern if we continue to delay it by another couple of years?
So, first let's understand that policies are being made on the basis of caste compositions and demographies, which actually have never been accounted for by scientific surveys. So it is not that surveys have not been carried out. The Mandal report itself was based on a kind of a survey. Subsequently, states have carried out surveys to enumerate the population in various groups and subgroups. But these are extremely rough and ready surveys. They do not even reach the level of sophistication, which is pretty low, by the way, that a population census reaches. Because the population census, a lot of exercise does go into it, as you said, years of preparation go into it and so on. So already, because policies exist, because we have job reservations, because we have reservations in educational institutions, because scholarships are categorized by on the basis of caste and so on, because as you rightly said, the minorities ministry also has certain quotas, certain policies, certain programs. For all these reasons, states already come up with rough and ready figures, but these figures actually correlate much worse than anything else would, any exercise in the census would, with actually the reality on the ground. So one has to understand that if you do not create better data, then poor quality data will continue to be used, because we do have affirmative action policies of all kinds, which are based on the caste demography across the different states in India and across the country as a whole.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us and really helping us understand this. And I think it was extremely helpful, the details that Professor Srivastava pointed out on what possibly could be the mistakes. Nevertheless, despite those mistakes and errors in the last census, why do we still need it? Because a lot of your policy making currently is on information assumed, not even on information available, and that's how it's being done. But if you want it to be effective, if you actually want affirmative action, if you actually want reservation policies, or even your caste specific and religion specific welfare policies to be effective, you need to base them on good, credible data. You need to know which are the castes and subcastes who are lagging behind, who are struggling and who need government help, and which is where then you bring about that government help. Why some political parties may be averse to it is because it may actually turn their entire current political strategy upside down, and that may not just be necessary for the current government or the party in power at the center, which is the BJP, but for several other parties who actually play a lot of caste-based identity politics. Their entire strategy may actually turn upside down once you realize that the percentages are different, the power structures are now different. We don't know, but that can't be a reason for us to not find out. If you are going to base a lot of your policies, government policies and schemes, reservations in health, in education, in jobs, basis caste categories and scheduled castes and scheduled tribes and OBCs, and if you are going to have agitations repeatedly in state after state with various other castes asking to be included in the reservation quota, in the OBC category or otherwise, then you need to know what's the reality out there. You also need to know what could be the margin for error and you factor that in. But to run away from a caste-based census possibly is not the solution. Thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Simplified.